Welcome back to the Sleep Menu. Tonight, we'll ease into the quiet corners of a world rarely seen. The slow, careful hours before the clash. When a village knows the rhythm of battle, it learns to listen for its own heartbeat. And the moments just before everything begins, that's where the story lives. These hours aren't filled with action, but with intention. Small choices, steady motions, and the sound of something vast moving closer. Before we go further, make sure you're comfortable. Let your eyes rest. Let your breath find a slower pace. There's nothing to keep up with here. Only a place to drift through, quietly. Let the world you know fade into the background as this one takes shape, brick by brick, heartbeat by heartbeat. The village had a stillness that didn't mean peace. It was the stillness of waiting. Not silence, but the kind of quiet you get when everyone already knows what's coming. Walls stood firm in a wide circle, stretching out beyond the training grounds, watchtowers, and huts. Torches lined the edges, flickering against stone and timber, casting long, shivering shadows. The air was thick with the scent of oil, iron, dust, and distant embers. And beneath it all, a quiet thrum. Not sound exactly, but tension. Like a string pulled just short of breaking. Inside the armory, rows of weapons had already been polished and placed. Spears leaned in neat lines. Shields hung like silent watchers on wooden beams. The blacksmith moved slowly, methodically, checking each piece again. Not because he doubted the work, but because he respected what it would soon be used for. The forge behind him still radiated warmth, its glow low but steady. He wiped the edge of a blade with a cloth, not for shine, but for readiness. In the center of the village, the spell factory glowed with soft, low pulses of light. The air shimmered faintly around it, waves of magic pulsing like breath. Inside, elixir flowed through glass tubes, pooling into swirling basins of magic. The colors shifted with every beat: violet, blue, faint silver. No words were spoken. The wizards overseeing the mixtures barely moved, hands hovering, eyes half closed, adjusting energy with small gestures. Precision mattered more than speed. One drop too much could undo hours of work. Near the barracks, footsteps crunched on gravel. Barbarians paced, not nervously, but with purpose. Helmets were strapped tight, boots laced high. They said little, but their eyes moved, always scanning, always counting. Their muscles moved like coiled ropes, still but tense. Somewhere nearby, a single horn rested against a post, not to be blown yet, but soon. It would sound when words no longer mattered. Villagers moved in quiet lines, reinforcing doors, checking traps, marking the ground with chalk and ash. Rope was tightened across entryways. Stones were stacked with care. Barrels were moved to strengthen corners. There were no shouts, no rush. Everyone knew what was coming, and how little control they had once it arrived. So they prepared the parts they could. One nailed board, one locked crate, one barrier raised. Somewhere beyond the walls, wolves howled, or maybe it was wind, but no one looked up. Their attention was here, on the ground beneath their feet, on the way tools felt in their hands, on the small jobs that built towards something larger than any of them. And as the stars turned above, the village watched the horizon, still, silent, ready. Not because they hoped to avoid the storm, but because they knew it always came. And this time, like every time, they would be ready to meet it. Smoke curled upward from the chimneys, thinning into the black sky like fingers, reaching toward a ceiling they would never touch. It didn't rise in panic or urgency, just steady ribbons of heat carrying the scent of pine, coal, cooked barley, and something faintly metallic, the smell of sharpened tools and iron waiting for orders. Beneath that rising haze, the village pulsed with quiet energy. Not loud, not frantic, just constant. Each movement served a purpose, each glance carried weight. Near the south wall, a builder moved carefully across the stone path, checking the seams between the foundation blocks one by one. He dragged his fingers along the lines of mortar, stopping when he reached a section that had begun to crack. Just slightly. A fracture, no wider than a finger, but enough to let rain, time, or force find its way in. He crouched, wiped dust from the edge, and wedged a split of timber into the gap to hold it for now. Tomorrow they'd reinforce the whole section, maybe replace the lower stone entirely. But tonight, it would hold. That was the point. Behind him, a troop of archers filed silently along the walkway, their footfalls soft but in rhythm. A silent rehearsal. They weren't headed anywhere new, just retracing the path they'd take if the alarm rang out. Familiar steps under dimming torchlight. One paused to adjust the strap on her quiver, checked the placement of each arrow, then fell back in line without a word. Their eyes didn't wander. Their minds already saw the path through smoke. Elsewhere, a pair of villagers pushed a wooden cart piled high with sandbags, the wheels squeaking faintly under the weight. They stopped at each tower base, laying the bags in a precise arc around the bottom, aligning them flush with the walls. Not armor, not weapons, but buffers, the kind that absorbed impact and stopped splinters. Things most didn't think about until a blast scattered the unprepared. They did their work in silence, breathing in rhythm, hands calloused, but steady. In the healer's hut, soft light spilled onto the path through an open window framed with drying herbs. Inside, rows of potions rested in a narrow cabinet, each one labeled in careful script. Strength, speed, recovery, clarity. The healer moved from shelf to shelf, checking for cracks in the glass, making sure the lids were tight, wiping condensation from the sides. One of the jars flickered with pale green light, a sign it was still potent. She nodded to herself, noted it on a small slate board, then moved on. Her hands never shook. The hog rider pens were quiet, but not still. A few of the beasts snorted, their thick sides shifting, hooves stamping into the hay. They picked up the unease in the air, not fear, but anticipation. Their riders stood nearby, oiling harnesses, checking buckles, running their hands along leather straps to feel for hidden flaws. No one spoke. Each man and woman had the same thought. If tonight was the last calm they'd get, they'd make every minute count, not by rushing, but by being exact. Overhead, the lookout in the highest watchtower stood motionless. One hand rested on the edge of the platform. The other shaded his eyes against the firelight. His gaze was fixed on the far tree line, where moonlight tangled with branches. The forest was still. No movement yet. But the forest never stayed still for long, and the village had learned long ago. It's best to prepare while there's still time to breathe. Not when the signal sounds, not when the gates groan open, but now, in the quiet, when no one else is watching, when the world believes nothing is happening. That's when everything truly begins. Dawn was still hours away, but the village had already chosen its pace. Slow, steady, and exact. Every task moved like it was part of a larger rhythm. Not chaotic, not fearful, just deliberate, like the hands of a clock that refused to rush. Each movement was purposeful. Each glance carried meaning. Even silence here felt like a practiced step in a greater pattern. Near the barracks, torches burned lower now, casting golden halos on the hard-packed earth and sending flickers along the walls of the nearby training field. A trainer walked slow circles around a squad of fresh recruits, their armor dull from wear, their eyes sharp from focus. He spoke softly, pointing not at the weapons in their hands, but at their footing, their posture, the grip of their fingers. Each note he gave was met with a small correction. No yelling, no barked orders. The loud work had already been done. This was refinement, the kind of detail that didn't show in peace but meant everything in battle. when a misstep could be the difference between holding the line or losing it. Even breath control mattered. The mess hall glowed dimly from within, tucked beneath the broad awning that fluttered faintly in the wind. Inside, cooks moved in near silence, setting out portions of hard bread, dried fruit, and thick stew. Not for celebration, but for strength. They worked without conversation, their rhythm long practiced. Behind them, cauldrons bubbled quietly, giving off a warm, herby steam that hung in the low air. Wooden bowls were stacked with care, spoons placed beside them in perfect rows. Every spoonful meant energy. Every portion was measured not in weight, but in endurance. No one lingered. The food wasn't meant to comfort. It was meant to fuel. At the village edge, the builder's tools had been laid out in precise lines along a long table beside the workshop. Ropes were coiled, nails counted, boards stacked in descending size, cut to specific lengths and labeled in chalk. No one was hammering now. The sound would echo across the walls. Instead, they whispered to one another, checking lists, nodding once before moving on. Their blueprints lay flat and weighted under stones. The repairs had all been made. Tonight wasn't for building. Tonight was for checking that what was built could hold. They moved their hands over the grain of the wood, testing for splinters or signs of warping. Even the lanterns they carried were shielded. No flame left to chance. In the spell factory, 2 enchanters stood over a swirling basin of dark blue liquid. It pulsed faintly, as if breathing. The room was lit only by that glow, the walls slick with condensation from the magic's low hum. One of them tapped the rim twice, then added a single shard of glowing crystal. The basin shifted color, blue to green to something in between. They waited. No explosion, no crack, just the soft hum of power stabilizing. They both exhaled, and one scribbled something quickly in a ledger. Nearby, a stack of finished spells, bottled, glowing faintly, sat nestled in soft cloth. Each was marked with a symbol, each one critical for the hour to come. Elsewhere, near the center square, a lone villager stood, staring at the sky. No tools in hand, no task left to do, just watching the stars fade one by one behind a cloud, drifting slowly east. She knew the work was nearly done, but she also knew the waiting was part of the work. Her breath steamed in front of her, barely rising. Behind her, the statue at the square's center stood still, its stone face shadowed under the fading starlight. She looked at it once, then back to the sky, as if the stars might offer a different answer. And as the night stretched thinner, the village kept its silence, not in fear, but in focus. Because the loudest part of the storm wasn't always the clash. Sometimes it was the stillness right before it, the kind that settles deep into the bones of a place and waits. The sky had faded into a pale slate gray. The first hint that morning wasn't far, though the sun still lay hidden behind the hills. The air was heavy and cool, the kind that carried the scent of earth, damp stone, old ash, and something faintly metallic, like the edge of a blade waiting to be drawn. The ground still held traces of night, cool and a little slick from low fog, and everything about the village seemed slowed, deliberate. Nothing stirred fast. No voices rose. The village moved like it had made a pact with silence, not just the kind that comes from quiet, but the silence of shared understanding. That these final hours before daylight were no longer ordinary. Near the central storage barn, 2 villagers worked without speaking, lifting sacks of grain and stacking them against the inner wall. Not because the grain was under threat, but because the wall on the north side was stronger, safer. The barn's beams creaked softly with each shift of weight. They worked in a rhythm so practiced, so perfectly in step. It sounded like one long breath being taken again and again. One lifted, the other braced, then switch. Dust kicked up and settled on their arms, sticking to the sweat that came not from haste, but from doing it right. Each sack stacked was a kind of insurance, a quiet vote against chaos. A short walk away, a row of traps was being checked beneath a stretch of overgrown hedges. These weren't simple snares or crude constructions. They were carefully engineered devices, tucked under false ground or blended into shadowed corners, designed not to maim, but to delay, to confuse. A younger builder followed behind an older one, eyes wide, ears sharp, learning the feel of tension in the wires, the way to spot a flaw, not with sight alone, but with fingertips. One trap was reset with a precise twist of copper. Another was marked for replacement with a strip of white cloth tied loosely to a branch. No alarm, no panic, just a nod, a scribbled note, and the scratch of chalk on stone to mark a place. Up in the watchtower, the sentry's shoulders had begun to ache, but he didn't shift his weight. His hands rested on the wooden railing, worn smooth by years of gripping and leaning. His eyes swept across the horizon in slow, deliberate arcs. The trees had started to sway more noticeably. Wind, maybe, or something moving beneath their cover. A shadow too quick? A flicker that didn't belong. He noted it, logged it silently in his mind, but didn't raise a signal. Observation came first. Assumption came later. That was the unspoken law of the tower. Never disturb the rhythm unless you were sure. In the healer's hut, soft bundles of cloth were unrolled across a wide table stained from years of preparation. Bandages, herbs, and tinctures were sorted, measured, and rewrapped with fresh twine. The healer hummed under her breath a not a melody, but a counted rhythm to keep track of the steeping time. Beside her, a young apprentice stirred a pot over a low flame, her brow furrowed in concentration, glancing often toward the shelves lined with stoppered bottles and chalk-marked jars. Each vial was labeled not just with its contents, but with when it had been mixed, how long it would hold, and for what wound. They both moved like time was running out, but neither looked worried. This was the tempo they knew best, the calm just before it's needed most. Outside the builder's yard, a group of villagers checked the wagons parked in a line along the north path. Wheels were tightened, axles inspected, leather straps examined for wear. Even though no retreat had been ordered, even though no one had spoken the word aloud, they prepared for the chance they might need to move fast. One wagon was packed with tools, saws, hammers, nails, and jars. Another with food, dried and salted. A third held blankets, spare clothes, sealed jars of clean water. A fourth had nothing yet, but space, just in case. Insurance against uncertainty, against the unknown, against that single distant horn they all hoped wouldn't sound. And back at the statue in the center of the square, where a single torch flickered low in the iron bracket, a villager stood again. Not the same as before, but one with the same posture. Still, watching, hands clasped behind their back, eyes fixed not on one place, but on the whole village. The way you look when you're memorizing something before it changes. Not all sentries stood in towers. Some stood in the open, holding nothing, and saw everything. And in that moment, they weren't waiting for trouble. They were just making sure everything else was ready if it ever came. The village had begun to hum, not with sound, but with presence. Every stone underfoot, every rope coiled beside a post, every banner hanging limp in the still air seemed aware that time was shifting. It wasn't yet dawn, but the world had begun to stir in its own quiet way. The chill in the air held a weight to it, not just from the cold, but from what was coming. Unseen, but certainly not unanticipated. That tension didn't need to shout. It whispered in the way boots landed a little softer, and in how eyes lingered on the horizon just a moment longer. Behind the main hall, the blacksmith stepped outside, wiping soot from his hands, with a cloth that had seen better days. His forge still glowed behind him, a low pulse of orange heat radiating from the stonework and casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. He glanced up at the sky, took one deep breath, and then crouched by a rack of spearheads cooling beside the door. Each one was inspected by touch, by weight, not just by sight. He wasn't looking for flaws. He was confirming readiness. Metal sang softly when tapped. That sound told him everything he needed to know. He picked up a pair of tongs, turned one of the blades gently to catch the light. Satisfied, he leaned it against the rest and moved on to check the hafts stored inside a wooden crate. Each shaft was smoothed, balanced. Some had names scratched near the top, owners who trusted the smith enough to bring their tools here for final checks. There was trust in those scratches, quiet contracts between warrior and craftsman. Near the stables, a rider brushed down her mount, not for show, not even for comfort, but to feel the animal's skin, check for warmth, soreness, a change in breath. The hogs and horses had their own senses. If something was wrong, they'd feel it first. She paused mid-stroke, pressed her ear to its side, then nodded once and continued. Her saddle and gear were already prepared, laid out in clean rows on a bench just beyond the fence. Every strap had been tested, every clasp cleaned. She moved with calm certainty, knowing that readiness wasn't something you rushed. It was something you earned, step by step, check by check. Along the edge of the market square, crates were being sealed shut. Not merchandise, supplies, bolts of cloth that could be used for wounds, coils of rope, flint, extra lanterns. A quiet pair of hands worked nail after nail into place, hammering with just enough force to hold, but never enough to echo. Each crate was labeled in chalk: North Tower, Granary, Fallback. Nearby, a child passed a bundle of rags to be used as kindling, then disappeared again without a word. Even the youngest knew there was no need for questions anymore. Everyone had their part. At the well, the bucket rope was replaced, not because the old one was frayed, but because it was wise to rotate strength before it failed. A carpenter tied the knot carefully, twice, then tested the coil's tension before lowering the pail once and listening to it strike the water below. When he pulled it up, the splash echoed faintly, swallowed quickly by the walls of the square. He paused before setting the bucket aside, eyes on the sky as if judging how many hours they had left. Inside a low storehouse, candles were lit. An elder traced their fingers over scrolls and ledgers, records of past attacks, past preparations, notes written in another's hand. They didn't speak, but their eyes moved quickly, stopping now and again to make a mark in the margins. One book had a ribbon marking a page titled, simply, Mistakes. Another was filled with tally marks and corrections, each one the weight of a lesson learned the hard way. It wasn't about predicting, it was about remembering what had worked, what hadn't, and how to hold the line when it counted most. And at the very far edge of the eastern path, where the trees began to press in closer, another villager sat quietly on a stump, not patrolling, not stationed, just watching. A lantern rested beside their feet, unlit. Their eyes never left the tree line. A hand rested gently on the hilt of a knife not drawn. Not yet. That wasn't their role. Not now. Sometimes light was a message, and sometimes darkness was the better shield, the kind that let you see first and speak later, the kind that knew patience was its own kind of defense. The sky had finally begun to fade toward blue, not the full light of day, but a hazy, fragile hue that whispered that dawn wasn't far. It wasn't the kind of brightness that rushed in. It crept inch by inch over the tops of trees and behind the thick edges of clouds. The village remained wrapped in that quiet blue, where things aren't yet clear, but can no longer hide. The wind stirred slightly more now, brushing through the treetops and tugging at the edges of banners, cloth wraps, and torch flames. You could hear the fabric move, the faint snap, the flutter, and it gave everything a rhythm. In the village, movements slowed even further, not from fatigue, but from precision. The last hour before a storm always moved like this, deliberate, intentional, like the air itself had memory. In the training grounds, a lone warrior moved through a series of forms. No audience, no commands. Just the practiced rhythm of feet shifting in dust, the soft swish of a blade through the air, and the quiet control in every breath. His armor rested beside him, folded in a neat pile, while he moved in the plain tunic of someone preparing their body before covering it in weight. He didn't train for speed. He trained for certainty. Every pivot, every step was muscle memory. He had done this in sun, in fog, in the echo of thunder, and now he did it in the stillness before dawn. The edge of the blade caught a sliver of light. That was enough. A pair of scouts returned from the northern ridge, boots lined with dirt, cloaks streaked with dew. They moved like shadows, their presence barely more than a shift in the air. They spoke to no one as they entered, heading directly to the strategy tent at the center of the village. One of them laid down a rolled parchment. The other pointed to a mark they'd etched along the edge. A clearing, new footprints, fresh signs, patterns in the undergrowth that hadn't been there before. The scoutmaster nodded once and dismissed them with a glance. No alarm was raised, but a small pile of red-tipped arrows was set aside near the entrance, just in case. Each one a silent acknowledgement that readiness had many shapes. Elsewhere, inside the storage cellar beneath the granary, bags of salt and preserved food were being shifted. Not moved out, but redistributed, ensuring that if one section collapsed, the others would hold. Stone columns lined the space like ribs. Between them, the workers moved with careful strength, stacking and adjusting, tapping the corners of crates to double-check stability. A younger villager asked a quiet question. The elder, working beside her, simply pointed, and the motion was understood. Words were becoming less necessary by the hour. Even the younger ones could feel it, that now was not the time for noise. Now was the time for knowing. Near the barracks, an old soldier sat on the edge of a wooden crate, sharpening a blade not for himself, but for someone younger. His fingers moved with the same calm repetition as they had for decades. Draw the stone, test the edge, wipe it clean, again and again. He looked up once, meeting the eyes of the recruit watching him. No speech, just a slow nod. It was enough. The younger fighter stood straighter after that. No training. Just understanding passed through silence. There are things older hands don't need to say. They show them instead. In the hut near the far well, a map was being unfolded across a long table. Several markers, some carved wood, some smooth stones, were being shifted around its surface. These weren't strategies for glory. These were escape paths, signal lines, fallback points, prepared not with panic, but with care. Each hand that moved a piece did so with the memory of past plans, ones that had held and ones that had failed. A thin thread of charcoal marked a new route, traced only this morning. The ink was still faint, but it was real, and it was there if they needed it. And back at the eastern path, where the forest pressed tight, the quiet watcher remained, still unmoving, still not lighting the lantern. But now their eyes were sharper, less searching, more confirming. The wind carried a different weight now. Not danger yet, but something close to it. A kind of pressure that curled at the edge of the senses. They didn't flinch. They didn't blink. Because sometimes, knowing where not to step is more powerful than charging forward. Sometimes, the stillest person is the one who sees first. And sometimes, readiness means knowing when not to move at all. It means letting the quiet do the talking, and trusting that stillness is not the absence of action, but the beginning of it. Somewhere above the hills, the first threads of sunlight began to stretch across the sky, painting the clouds in quiet golds and ash blues. But in the village below, that light didn't bring relief. It brought focus. Clarity sharpened by the edge of day. No roosters crowed, no bells rang. This wasn't a morning like any other. This was a hinge between two worlds, the last breath before the rhythm changed. It was the type of morning that hung heavy, suspended in time, like the entire landscape was taking a deep breath and holding it. Down near the armory, the door creaked open with a soft groan. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil, iron, leather, and days of labor folded into every crevice. A line of helmets rested on a long bench, each one polished to a dull shine that reflected the low light seeping through the high, narrow window. A craftsman moved between them, checking straps and buckles, lifting one now and then to test its balance. He wasn't rushing. He was listening to the way the pieces settled into place, to the sound of readiness echoing in the absence of noise. Each item had a feel, a weight, a readiness that could only be confirmed by touch. Outside, another worker began lining shields along the wall, each edge marked in red paint. The marks weren't for show. They were assignments, roles, positions, visual language in a place where words might soon fall away. Across the square, a young villager ran their hand along the edge of the outer wall. Stone, wood, reinforced seams. Each section touched was an anchor in the mind, a checklist, a map, a memory of where things should hold and where they might give. Further along, two others reinforced a gate hinge, layering it with fresh rope, not because it had failed, but because they wouldn't let it. Their hands moved quickly, efficiently, the kind of confidence that only comes from doing something over and over, not just in preparation, but in understanding exactly what failure looked like. On the rooftops, a figure lay flat, bow resting beside them, eyes scanning the distant tree line. This wasn't an active post. It was a choice, a higher view, a different angle. They moved slowly, shifting their weight inch by inch, adjusting their line of sight. From here they could see the edge of the river bend, the dip in the hills where early movement might appear. They weren't aiming yet, but they were ready to. Their hand hovered near the quiver, not gripping but ready to grip. Stillness here was its own form of readiness, a tension in the body as much as in the air. Back on the ground, the cook fire burned lower than usual, just embers now. A pot hung over it, slow cooking one final batch of stew. Not for breakfast, but for the hours after. If there were hours after. The cook stirred it once, then set the lid gently in place, tying a cloth over the top. She didn't look worried. She looked resolved. Her eyes scanned the edges of the square before she sat, wiping her hands on her apron. This wasn't about the food anymore. This was about marking time. One last normal act before everything shifted. Near the water troughs, two riders checked their saddles one last time. Not the straps. Those had been checked. But the horses. Their eyes. Their hooves. Their breathing. Each sign told a different story. One mount snorted softly. The other stamped the earth. They were alert. They were waiting. The riders walked the length of the pen, tightening loose ropes, adjusting feed buckets, whispering softly into twitching ears. The animals could feel it too, that strange heaviness in the air. And near the south fence, where the path bent just out of sight, a pile of stones had been arranged carefully into a low wall. Behind it, a single figure sat cross-legged, fingers steepled in front of them, eyes closed. Not sleeping. Listening. You could hear the difference in the wind now, how it cut through the trees more sharply, how it paused. A bird's call rang out, sharp and short, then was gone. Even nature held its breath. It was almost time. And in this village, that meant it was time to hold steady, right up until the wind broke. until the signal that didn't need to be spoken made its presence known. Because sometimes the surest move is stillness, and sometimes silence is the loudest preparation of all. Because when you have done everything else you can do, what's left is this: to breathe, to brace, and to be ready for whatever steps out of the morning light. The sun had broken the horizon now, but it hadn't yet warmed the earth. Its light spread low and gold, stretching long shadows across the rooftops and walls, casting each building in a soft amber glow. The village didn't rush to meet the day. It shifted into it, slowly, carefully, like someone waking from a dream they weren't ready to leave behind. But there was no dream here. Just the shape of expectation hanging in the air, pressing gently against every door frame and window pane. Even the birds, usually the first to fill the morning with chatter, were subdued. Their songs came hesitantly, as if uncertain whether they were allowed to break the hush. The breeze was just enough to rattle a loose shutter or tug softly at the edges of a banner, whispering through the narrow alleys with the hush of something sacred. Down near the old watch platform, a team of workers adjusted the last of the rope ladders. These weren't for climbing. During peace, these were evacuation paths, quick routes down if the upper floors were compromised. Each knot was checked twice. Each plank tapped gently for weakness, and the sound of wood answering wood echoed faintly. They didn't speak much. Just a few gestures, a few nods. One worker traced the base of the support beam with a piece of chalk, marking a notch for replacement after the next sunrise, if there was a next sunrise. Another ran their fingers along the grain of the post as if committing its imperfections to memory. At the training field, older warriors took younger ones through mock drills, not for strength, but for calm. One step back, pivot, shield to the left, speak with your eyes. These weren't battle cries. These were reminders. When everything else fell apart, these movements would hold. Their feet scuffed the earth in soft patterns, and every now and then a trainer would adjust a wrist, reposition a heel, and nod without a word. These drills were less about defending the village and more about defending the mind, a ritual to ground the body in the middle of looming uncertainty. A pair of builders stacked barrels behind the town hall. Not weapons, water. If the fire came, they'd be ready. Not to save everything, just to hold the heart of the village a little longer. The barrels were heavy and damp from the morning dew, their wooden hoops creaking under the shifting weight. Behind them, a third worker dragged a length of canvas over the roof edge, weighting it with stones so it could serve as both camouflage and shield. They worked without conversation, moving like a well-wound mechanism, each part responding to the other's motion. In the healer's shed, bundles of herbs were laid out on flat trays, and long rows of cloth wraps hung from lines. The smell of dried lavender, salt, and vinegar filled the small room, mixed with hints of thyme and a trace of smoke from the smoldering coals under the stew of salves. Two assistants worked side by side, bundling tinctures into padded satchels. They were quiet, but their hands moved like they'd done this 100 times. And they had. Each pouch wasn't just a remedy. It was a second chance, waiting to be used. Vials were labeled in thick ink. The string used to tie each bundle was cut to precise lengths. Even the smallest detail held meaning here. Beyond the far edge of the village, the scout returned, alone. Dust clung to their cloak. Their eyes were wide, but not panicked, just watchful. Their steps were slow, calculated. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They walked with the slow certainty of someone who had seen what needed seeing. A twig was stuck in their hood, and their boots were damp with marsh water. When they reached the gate, they handed a folded piece of cloth to the guard. No words, just that. The guard nodded once, then turned. The cloth bore a faint mark, a symbol known only to those who needed to know. And that was enough. Because in a place like this, you don't need alarms when everyone's already listening. You don't need a cry when the silence carries more weight. You don't need fear when every hand knows its task. And as the village held its breath once more, the ground beneath seemed to lean in with them, waiting, but not afraid, ready. Stillness had become its own kind of strength, a pause before movement, a vow made quietly between every heartbeat and held with every breath. The morning light had begun to stretch farther now, spilling between rooftops and pooling in quiet corners where shadows once ruled. The warmth hadn't fully arrived, but the glow carried more conviction, less suggestion, more presence. Windows flickered with gold, edges of tools caught the shimmer, and even the dirt paths seemed to reflect the hush of day breaking open. In the center of the village, the rhythm slowed even more, not out of fear, but because every step mattered now. This was no longer preparation. This was the thin moment between waiting and acting. The breath just before the answer. The weightless second before a fall. In the central corridor that ran between the barracks and the watchtower, an older villager swept the path with deliberate strokes. Dust and stray leaves curled up with each pass of the broom. He wasn't cleaning for appearance. He was clearing the way. A broom wasn't just a tool now. It was a brush sweeping tension off the earth. He paused often, leaning into the broom handle, not because he was tired, but because he was listening. The way a stone echoes beneath your boot tells you if it's loose. The way silence sits in the alley tells you if something has changed. A faint hum from the air, a shift in echo, the click of a pebble disturbed. All of it carried meaning. On a rooftop above, a scout adjusted the angle of a mirror set between two crates. The mirror wasn't for vanity. It was a signal relay. One flick in the right direction, and a dozen eyes across the outposts would shift. It hadn't been used in weeks, but now it was polished, realigned, and checked for visibility. The scout ran a gloved hand across its back. Smooth, cool, ready. She checked the sun's angle, tested the flash once against a clay wall, then tucked herself low again. From her perch, she could see far beyond the village edge, past the dry stream bed, into the sloping hills that held secrets in their folds. Near the granary, someone was checking the hinges on the cellar door again. Not because it hadn't been checked before. It had. But because some things get checked twice or 3 times. A tight hinge might save a storehouse. A quiet latch might protect the last sack of grain. There was a kind of comfort in that repetition, a kind of promise. And when the same hand tested the edge of the doorframe for signs of stress, a crack, a warped plank, anything that might give, it wasn't just habit. It was memory. Memory of the last time something failed, when it shouldn't have. Inside the town hall, a council member traced the edge of the village map with a fingertip. Not hurriedly, slowly, as if every line and bend was being memorized all over again. They marked nothing, moved nothing, just followed the borders. Every path, every road, every place a foot might fall. Their lips moved slightly, counting, naming, recalling who lived where supplies were stashed, which wall had been reinforced last. To an outsider, it might have seemed obsessive, but to them, it was the shape of care. They were holding the whole village in their mind. Out past the east road, a boy walked alongside an older man, neither of them speaking. The man carried nothing but a shovel. The boy carried a wrapped bundle. They stopped near a tree with thick roots and a wide trunk, one of the oldest in the region. The shovel went in once, then twice. They were digging. Not a grave. Not yet. Just space. For something to be remembered, or something to be hidden. A box, maybe. A letter. A promise too valuable to leave exposed. They worked in silence. The boy placed the bundle into the earth like it mattered more than anything else. Because to him, it did. And all around the village the wind changed, slightly. It moved differently between the buildings. It whistled low along the cracks in the stone, as if warning the earth beneath it. Flags didn't flap. They twisted slowly, caught in an invisible current. Doors that had been still creaked faintly. The trees along the ridge leaned in. The message was clear. Whatever was coming wasn't waiting for permission. And neither was the village. They didn't need a horn. They just needed each other, and the quiet confidence that everything was ready, even if no one ever said it aloud. Because real readiness doesn't speak. It breathes in the dust, holds firm in stillness, and listens with both ears open to the turning of the world. By mid-morning, the light had shifted from soft gold to a pale, watchful yellow, the kind that didn't dazzle but revealed, not loudly, but insistently. It slid across rooftops like a whisper, etched shadows into the cracks between stones, and settled into corners where dust waited, undisturbed for days. In this village, that kind of light wasn't just another part of the day. It was a quiet signal. Not a command, not a warning, but an invitation to take notice. The time for listening was fading. The time for motion hovered just outside the frame. In the shadow of the bell tower, the bell itself sat untouched. No rope pulled, no sound rung. It hadn't chimed in seasons, not since the last siege, and yet its presence still felt heavy. A single villager sat nearby on a stool, one hand resting on their knee, the other cradling the frayed edge of the rope. They weren't guarding it. No one expected it to ring. But they sat with it, quietly, like one might sit beside an old friend who hadn't spoken in a long time. Not all tools are used often. Some are kept for moments that redefine everything. Across the open square, a potter moved slowly, stacking clay jars into a wagon. Each jar was sealed with wax, labeled in charcoal, and padded with straw cut from last autumn's harvest. These weren't for market, not for trade. Water, oil, grain, resin, basic things, elemental things. Things that became critical when movement was dangerous and doors stayed closed. The cart groaned as it filled, pushed not by urgency but by intent. The potter paused between stacks, not to rest, but to measure space. She worked with a rhythm that came from many days of doing things the hard way. That rhythm had become a kind of armor. Behind the apothecary, two children crouched in the dirt. They weren't fighting. They weren't laughing. They folded long strips of linen and dipped them into a basin of water laced with ash and vinegar. Their fingers, small and practiced, pressed each bandage into a flat coil, then stacked them into a wooden box lined with cloth. They didn't need to be told what to do. Their movements were deliberate. Their silence said everything. Children always knew. Even when adults tried to protect them from what was coming, they knew. At the south wall, a watchman leaned into a narrow slit between two wooden planks, his body angled just so. He stared for long minutes, eyes narrowed against the distance. The land beyond lay still, a line of trees, unmoving. A patch of tall grass bent strangely, a silence that felt too smooth, too measured. He didn't raise a cry. Instead, he stepped back, pulled a piece of parchment from his belt, and marked a single shape with the corner of a charcoal nub. One small symbol. Then he folded the note, tucked it back beneath his coat, and returned to his post. In the orchard just beyond the gardens, 3 villagers worked without words. Rope coiled at their feet, netting stretched between branches. They weren't harvesting fruit. They were bracing the trees, tying limbs that leaned too close to the fence. Not because of the fruit could wait, but because trees gave shade, trees gave cover. If branches snapped in the wrong direction, they'd expose too much. So each knot was deliberate, each rope a decision. They didn't tie for strength, They tied for time. Delay was a kind of survival. And in a small hut behind the animal pens, a woman worked alone, her back to the open door, her fingers threaded through a pile of torn leather straps. The leather was stiff in places, worn thin in others. She wasn't mending armor, not in the traditional sense. She was shaping it, cutting usable lengths from scraps, creating grips for spears, ties for boots, makeshift belts. She hummed softly as she worked, not out of joy, but out of focus. Her blade moved carefully. Even the torn edges had purpose. Even the ruined pieces had worth. The village didn't speak of fear. There were no whispered doubts, no trembling hands. But fear lingered anyway, not in the voices, but in the pauses. You could hear it in the way steps slowed at corners, in how tools were set down just a little more carefully than usual. The way eyes lingered a second longer on the edge of town. Measured, intentional, committed. They didn't need noise to mean something. They had movement. And as the sun continued its climb, they stood with it. Not proudly, not defiantly, but firmly. No alarm, no panic. Just readiness carved into every motion, shaped by weeks of watching and hours of preparing. Because when you trust each task, no matter how small, you don't have to raise your voice. You just keep going. And going is enough. The sun pressed higher now, its rays landing heavy across rooftops and stone paths, turning dew into steam and drawing sharp contrast between light and shadow. This was no longer the soft morning haze. It was the kind of sunlight that held its own weight, that made you squint even when your eyes weren't facing it. The kind that touched everything with a sense of finality. As if the day had made its choice and was moving forward, whether you followed or not. The warmth felt less like comfort now, and more like exposure. It reached into corners that wanted to stay hidden and cast long, clear lines where indecision used to live. In the northern fields, a line of villagers walked the ridge, each one spaced a dozen paces apart. They weren't harvesting, they weren't scouting, they were marking. Small flags, half-buried stones, chalk signs on tree bark. These weren't instructions for anyone else. They were reminders for themselves. If you had to run, if you had to scatter, you needed to know where not to step. You needed to remember where safety bent, where danger began. Some flags were angled just so, turned like they were speaking in code. One villager paused, adjusted a rock by half a handspan, then kept walking, as if those few inches might make all the difference later. Closer to the village center, a blacksmith emerged from his forge, wiping his hands on a soot-blackened cloth. He didn't carry a blade or a hammer, just a small bundle of nails and a coil of wire. Repairs, not weapons. Reinforcement. On the side of a supply shed, a panel had warped in the heat. He set to work without a word. The strikes of his hammer were dull, but deliberate. Each one settled like a punctuation mark in a sentence only he could read. Nearby, a second pair of hands helped him lift the frame back into alignment. And for a moment, their silence was louder than any orders. It was coordination born of repetition, like music, without notes. In the communal kitchen, the hearth still glowed with low heat. Pots had been cleared, counters wiped down. But in a clay bowl by the window, someone had left a pile of hand-tied bundles, dried fruit, a few nuts, a slice of hardened bread. Nothing luxurious, but something that could last in a pocket. Meant not for feasting, but for endurance. Next to it, a smaller bundle of herbs, bitter but energizing, was carefully wrapped in a cloth stamped with a symbol of protection. Someone had thought beyond hunger. They were preparing for exhaustion, for the moment when momentum would need help from something else. At the small well behind the grain stores, a pair of villagers passed a single bucket between them, filling canteens with slow precision. They didn't rush. They timed their pour so nothing was spilled. One of them tapped each canteen's cap twice before placing it aside. It wasn't superstition. It was habit. Muscle memory that came from knowing that in some moments, losing a drop could cost more than losing a sword. One canteen clinked faintly, its cap not tight enough. The younger of the two paused, adjusted it, tested again. Only when it passed the second check did he nod and slide it into the pile. On the edge of the village, near a bend in the fence where the view reached longest, a sentry adjusted the straps of his armor. Not for comfort, but for silence. He checked the buckles, felt the fabric beneath, then knelt. He pressed his palm to the dirt, closed his eyes. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, in the distance, a bird call. Too short, too sharp, not natural. His brow furrowed slightly. He tilted his head, listening again. Nothing followed. Just wind. He didn't stand. He didn't shout. But when he rose, his hand hovered over the hilt of his blade. Not drawn, but acknowledged. His gaze swept slowly across the horizon, marking each notch in the tree line, memorizing the shapes that didn't belong. He knew better than to act too fast. Timing mattered more than strength now, because sometimes the difference between calm and chaos is one heartbeat. And in this village, every heartbeat counted. Every pause was part of a bigger rhythm, and the rhythm was changing, not in shouts, but in stillness. Stillness that knew exactly what to do when the next sound came. The sun had nearly reached its peak now, casting short, direct shadows that made every movement stand out more clearly. There was no mistaking anything in this light, no blurring of lines. Everything was defined, crisp, unforgiving, but not cruel, just honest. This was the hour when the world stopped hiding, when even the smallest cracks in the walls were made visible, and hesitation had nowhere left to tuck itself away. In the upper courtyard, 2 farmers were laying sand along the pathways. Not for decoration, but for traction. Loose gravel had a way of sliding underfoot when you least expected it, and in moments of urgency, even a stumble could cost more than time. They poured carefully, spreading each handful with a wide sweep of their palms. The grains caught in the grooves of the cobblestones, locking in place like puzzle pieces that knew their role. The farmers moved steadily, one occasionally pressing his boot into the fresh spread to test the grip. The other wiped sweat from his brow, then reached for more sand. Their movements were wordless, choreographed by routine and necessity. It was the kind of work that wouldn't get noticed if everything went right, but might be the difference if everything didn't. Beneath the northern gate archway, a group of villagers practiced opening and closing the gate silently. They timed the hinges, adjusted their grip on the iron handles, and pulled ropes with practiced precision. No clanging, no creaking, just motion, clean and exact. A quiet rhythm that could mean the difference between being seen and being passed over. One villager crouched with a rag, oiling the hinge slowly, wiping excess from the metal with tight circles. Another watched from the shadows, counting each movement, committing it to memory. They switched positions, again and again, until the motion was as seamless as breathing. In the tailor's workspace, long bolts of fabric were being measured and cut, not into robes or dresses, but into wraps, bindings, and straps. The cloth wasn't soft. It was tightly woven, dyed in earthen tones meant to blend with soil and bark. A seamstress stitched quickly but carefully, her needle punching tiny footsteps through the weave. Each bundle was tied off with a slip knot, easy to release, easy to fasten again. Around her, spools of thread hung from nails driven into the wall, sorted by thickness. She paused only to test the strength of a knot by pulling it tight around her wrist, then tugging sharply. No break. It passed. She nodded to herself and moved on to the next. Near the granary, someone was marking wooden crates with symbols scorched into the surface with heated rods. Not letters, not words, just shapes. A diagonal slash meant food. A half circle meant tools. A triangle pointed down for weight. These signs could be read in the dark. They could be recognized, even if the paint faded or the box fell sideways. They weren't pretty. They were useful. One crate smoked faintly as the mark was pressed in, the smell of singed wood mixing with the dry scent of grain. A second villager stacked the marked crates carefully, aligning corners, tapping lids to check their seal. At the training ground, a single warrior practiced footwork alone. No weapons, no armor, just bare feet on packed dirt, moving through patterns memorized over years. Shift left, step back, pivot, brace, pause, begin again. The motion wasn't fast, it wasn't meant to be, it was steady, unbroken, a ritual. The dust he kicked up barely rose before settling again, as if even the ground respected his discipline. Each turn was precise, each breath matched to movement. In the distance, someone watched, mirroring the steps faintly with their own body, not yet ready to join, but close. And tucked between two buildings, hidden from the main path, a quiet group sat in a circle. No one spoke. Each one held a piece of parchment, folded and sealed. Messages, names, instructions. They weren't letters of goodbye. They were blueprints of memory. Where to find what? Who to turn to? What to do if the signals stopped? A kind of map written not in roads or buildings, but in trust. One by one, they placed the folded pages into a clay jar. The jar was sealed with wax and wrapped in cloth. It would be buried before dusk, not out of fear, but out of foresight. The village didn't stop because the sun rose higher. It didn't freeze in place because the light grew sharper. It adapted. It shifted. It focused. Because survival doesn't always look like battle. Sometimes it looks like precision. Sometimes it looks like 100 tiny choices made right. Boots that don't slip, doors that don't squeak, threads that don't snap under tension. Sometimes it's just one more step, done right, done well, done quietly, that keeps the world from slipping. And this village wasn't slipping. It was holding on, one perfectly placed action at a time, with no applause, with no need for one. By the time midday arrived, the heat had settled across the village like a quiet command, the kind that didn't shout or push, but insisted. It curled around corners, pressed down on rooftops, and soaked into every surface it touched. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, wide and cloudless, offering no escape. It looked endless, like it might swallow the horizon if you stared long enough. The wind had slowed to a breath, barely enough to rustle a banner or stir a loose thread on a tunic. But inside the village, the work didn't pause. It simply shifted its weight, changed its shape without losing momentum. At the water troughs, two villagers knelt, scrubbing tools with cloth soaked in a vinegar solution. They weren't sharpening weapons. They were cleaning garden shears, saw blades, even simple shovels. Rust was the enemy here, just as much as fire or arrows. A clean tool was a reliable one, and reliability, more than strength, was what mattered now. The sun glinted off the metal, turning each edge into a quiet warning. They worked in tandem, rinsing and drying, stacking the tools with methodical care. A third villager came by to inspect the pile, running a fingertip across each cleaned blade as if to feel the intent baked into the steel. Under the long canopy near the storage huts, a few elders sat cross-legged, sorting through cloth bundles, not out of nostalgia, but strategy. Each piece held something, an old token, a folded note, a key to a cellar, a stone with markings. These weren't heirlooms in the sentimental sense. They were chosen for meaning, for purpose. They weren't hoarding. They were redistributing. What you carried mattered. What you passed on could matter even more. One woman folded a scarf tightly, pressing a small coin into its center before handing it off to a runner with a nod. No words were exchanged, just trust. Another elder whispered instructions to a child, drawing invisible shapes on the back of their hand. A direction, a code, a quiet contingency. At the west wall, a wooden ladder was being tested. A group of builders took turns ascending and descending slowly, shifting their weight on each rung. They didn't climb high, just enough to see what cracked, what held. Each time a creak sounded, it was noted. Each time a rung flexed too far, it was marked with charcoal. Better now than later. Later wouldn't allow for second chances. One of them paused, held a rung with both hands, and gave it a deliberate shake. Another tapped the side with a small mallet, listening to the sound. They weren't just building access. They were building trust into wood and nails. Near the livestock pens, someone was tightening harnesses and reins. Not for farming, for movement. A pair of carts had been pulled into position under the shade of a large tree, covered in canvas and lightly packed with essential supplies. Grain sacks, firewood, bundles of rope, flasks of oil. Each item had been selected, packed, and repacked. Every strap was tested, every wheel spun and checked for wobble. They didn't look like escape carts. They looked like routine. And maybe that was the point. Nothing drew attention, like urgency. But familiarity? That could pass unseen. One of the handlers walked a loop around the carts, hand resting on each axle as they passed, feeling for imbalance. Beside the well, a young boy was carefully carving symbols into a wooden plank with a blunt nail. They weren't complex, just simple shapes, copied from the markings on the crates earlier. A line, a circle, a star. He worked slowly, tongue pressed to his teeth, fully absorbed. His mother watched from a few feet away, not correcting him, just letting him learn, letting him participate in the only way she could let him. Another child joined, holding a second plank. They compared symbols, trading smiles and small nods of agreement. Even in silence, they spoke fluently. Their world wasn't exempt from the preparation. It was being shaped by it. And in the quiet of the outer field, a lone figure stood with their back to the village, eyes on the far ridge. They weren't a guard. They weren't armored. Just someone watching, hands behind their back, breathing slowly, as if they were listening to the earth itself, waiting for the next whisper, a shift in wind, a bird falling silent, the small signs that came before the big ones. A breeze passed, faint but different, carried with it a scent not local. Their head tilted slightly. Not alarm, just notice. A filing away of detail for later. The village wasn't loud. It wasn't still. It was something else entirely. Tuned, like a string pulled tight, waiting to be plucked. And no one here was flinching. They were listening, and ready to move with the first vibration. The sun stood stubbornly at its highest point now, a quiet sentinel above the village, indifferent and unmoving. The air shimmered slightly where heat met stone, and even the birds had gone still, choosing shadow over song. The village pulsed in low rhythms, not frantic, not weary, but measured. It was the tempo of people who understood that preparation wasn't a moment. It was a state. Near the granary wall, two villagers spread pitch along the seams of a recently repaired storage shed. The tar clung to their gloves in thick black ribbons, melting into cracks that no rain had touched for weeks. They weren't fixing for the weather. They were sealing in silence, and making sure the contents inside didn't rattle, shift, or speak when the time came. One of them stopped every few minutes to run a palm across the boards, feeling for warmth, as if the wood itself could reveal whether it was truly ready. Just past the southern alley, someone was taking down a line of hanging laundry, not because it was dry, but because it didn't belong there anymore. Bright colors drew eyes. Movement caught attention. What had once been part of daily life was now risk. The sheets and tunics were folded quickly, but gently, and stacked beneath a stairwell, not discarded, just hidden until safety returned. A small group gathered outside the main hall, each holding a different tool, a chisel, a spade, a roll of twine. They spoke in turns, pointing to a map scratched into the dirt with a stick. It wasn't a strategy meeting in the usual sense. There were no commands, no plans barked across the courtyard. Just quiet agreement. A nod here, a gesture there. They weren't deciding what to do. They were aligning how to do it. Inside one of the homes, an older woman moved from shelf to shelf, collecting small glass bottles and carefully wrapping them in cloth. Each one held something useful, not flashy, not rare. Salves, powders, smoked herbs wrapped in parchment. She packed them into a leather pouch and tied it with a string that had once fastened her husband's cloak. Her fingers lingered on the knot. Not sentiment. Calibration. Beyond the eastern fence, where the tree line grew thick, a scout returned at a slow walk. His tunic was smudged with bark dust, and the soles of his boots left quiet prints in the dirt. He didn't speak as he passed the gate. He just made eye contact with a sentry, nodded once, and disappeared behind the stables. His return said more than a message could. Whatever he'd seen, whatever he hadn't, it was noted, registered, folded into the shape of the day. By the fountain near the old stone statue, 2 children played a wordless game, moving pebbles between chalk-drawn circles. They didn't know the rules. Or maybe they did, and no one else had been told. Their laughter was soft, more breath than sound, and when their mother called to them from across the square, they paused only long enough to look her way, before continuing. Not all noise was bad. Some of it reminded the village why they were preparing at all. Not all stillness meant fear. Some of it meant focus. And not every plan required an audience. Because in this village, the loudest things weren't said aloud. They were carried, in gestures, in memory, in readiness that looked like habit, and the habit was holding strong. The afternoon light had shifted, dulling into something flatter, more subdued. It no longer gleamed. It hovered, suspended in the still air like dust caught in a beam. Shadows thickened but didn't stretch, sinking closer to the ground as if too weary to move. The breeze that swept through the alleys was no longer warm but cautious, curling softly around corners as if checking each one for permission. It was the kind of breeze that brought with it the taste of something unsettled, something just out of view. Yet the village carried on, not rushing, not retreating, simply adjusting its rhythm again. A living system that responded without panic, without complaint, only quiet determination. At the training yard, a pair of archers stood opposite rows of stacked hay bales. They weren't practicing to impress or compete. They were practicing to repeat, to carve muscle memory into their bodies until every draw, every release came without thought. One archer drew and released with calm consistency, each arrow whispering against the air before thudding deep into the straw. Her feet were planted, her shoulders relaxed. The other paused more often, adjusting stance, tilting her head, feeling the bowstring with fingertips as if memorizing its tension again. The two moved in tandem like dancers rehearsing steps passed down for generations. They barely spoke. The sounds between them, the creak of the bough, the thump of impact, the scrape of a boot on dust, were enough. Those sounds filled the yard like punctuation, subtle and rhythmic. In a shaded alley between 2 stone houses, someone traced chalk lines on the wall at knee height. The lines curved, intersected, and looped back like a forgotten language, a message whispered from memory. But they weren't messages for others to read. They were markers. If the smoke ever came this way, if panic clouded Dortmund, judgment, these symbols would show where the air moved fastest, where it lingered, where it could be breathed. The villager stood up, stepped back, and nodded once. Not perfect, but understood. The symbols would be invisible in the dark, but not to those who knew where to look. A second set of lines followed, lower and fainter, drawn for smaller eyes. The children would need to know too. A cobbler knelt outside her doorway, sorting through a small pile of worn-out sandals. She wasn't repairing them in the usual sense. She was stripping them down for parts. Good leather, usable thread, soles that hadn't cracked. The usable pieces went into one pile, the useless ones into another. A third, smaller pile was for straps, things that could tie or fasten in a pinch. She worked without hurry, fingers confident, separating what could serve from what could not. Her knife moved with practiced ease, slicing clean lines without waste. In a moment of trouble, even a scrap could make the difference. A wrist strap, a latch for a pack, a makeshift sling. She hummed under her breath, a steady rhythm to match her hands. On the hill above the village where the wind met the tree line, a boy stood with a kite fashioned from old parchment and thin sticks. He let the string run, keeping the kite aloft, swaying gently against the sky. It wasn't for fun. The kite bore a small strip of cloth painted in 3 colors. If the wind shifted too hard, or the kite pulled too far left, the cloth would flutter in a certain way. A simple signal. Easy to read. From below. The boy squinted into the light, gauging angles, watching the cloth's behavior. He adjusted the line with slow, careful tugs, calibrating the position as precisely as any craftsman. He watched the sky as intently as any guard on the wall, aware that his small task was part of something much larger. Back in the heart of the village, 2 women tied bundles of kindling under a canvas awning. The sticks were uniform, bound in neat loops, with twine that had been soaked and dried to resist fraying. They didn't talk much, only exchanged looks when a bundle was too thick or too thin. The rhythm of their hands matched the quiet of the day. One of them paused to wipe her forehead, then resumed without a word. Occasionally, they shifted the finished bundles into neat stacks along the wall. A third woman came by with a basket and began to load them in careful layers, weaving them like puzzle pieces to conserve space. These weren't bundles for fires of comfort. They were for purpose. Signal fires, cooking during silence, heat without sound. Nothing had arrived yet. No horns echoed in the distance. No smoke curled beyond the hills. No foreign footfalls disturbed the dust. But everything said the same thing. Readiness was a language of its own. And everyone here was fluent. Fluent in quiet precision. Fluent in the art of patience sharpened into preparation. And as the day began its slow descent, the village held its breath. Not in fear, but in knowing. Because knowing was the difference. And they knew what had to be done. The sun had begun to lean westward, its brightness softening just enough to cast longer, more uncertain shadows across the village. The light no longer blazed. It hovered, mellow and wide, painting every edge in gold and dust. It wrapped around the buildings like a blanket tugged gently down, quieting the noise of earlier hours. The stillness of the afternoon lingered, but now it had a different edge. Not tense, not loud, just sharper, like a tool freshly honed and laid carefully beside its task. Every corner of the village felt that subtle shift. It wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. It was in the pause before a door opened, the extra glance at a set of tracks, the way footsteps carried a half-beat longer. Even the air seemed to hesitate before brushing past. Near the western slope, villagers gathered at a modest lookout tower, a wooden frame with a platform high enough to see the river bend and the thick treetops beyond. 2 climbed to the top, one carrying a pair of polished brass tubes wrapped in cloth. The other held a slate and chalk, worn down from repeated use. They weren't there to alert or call attention. Their job was to observe, to track movement, light changes, sky patterns, anything that whispered a change before it roared. One watched the shadows shift against the far ridge, The other made notations on the slate. They spoke softly, trading short phrases and glances. Not fear. Focus. They adjusted their positions in silence, trading tools as the sun moved. The sky held no birds. That meant something too. In a narrow shed tucked between two homes, a carpenter worked with quiet intensity on a strange-looking wooden box. It wasn't a crate or storage bin. It had sliding panels, hollow compartments, and leather straps across the back. A disguised carrier, meant to look like nothing but hold something important. Maps, scrolls, vials, maybe messages, maybe something heavier. He tested each panel with a gentle tap, adjusting a groove here, smoothing an edge there. His hands moved like he was finishing a puzzle only he had seen. A thin piece of cloth was pressed into one seam, a false divider. A tiny latch was fitted beneath a brass hinge. He didn't hurry. The box would be finished before sundown, and it would carry what couldn't be trusted to words. Down by the irrigation ditches, two teenagers dragged a canvas tarp over a trench, their arms coated in dirt and sweat. The tarp was coated in wax, stiff and weatherproof. They pegged it down at the corners, testing the stakes before scattering dry brush and leaves across its surface. A disguise. From above, it would look like just another patch of land, but underneath it could hold 4 people, maybe 6, in silence and safety. One of them crawled inside to test the space. The other waited, then knocked twice. A coded check. All clear. When the first teen emerged, they exchanged a look, neither smiling, but both nodding. They began to drag a second tarp toward another trench, a rhythm already forming between them. At the edge of the fields, a group of villagers moved in a loose arc, placing small cloth bundles under rocks and at the base of fence posts. Each bundle contained different things: salt, crushed herbs, tiny flint shards, folded slips of parchment. Some were for healing, some were for marking. Some were simply traditions no one could quite explain, but everyone honored. A few carried scents, meant to confuse tracking animals. One woman knelt a little longer at a fence post, her hand resting on the soil, eyes closed. Whether it was prayer or memory, no one asked. Her breath was even, slow, sinking with the wind. When she stood, she pressed her fingers to her lips, then to the stone, and walked on. A boy near the baker's hut was carefully drawing circles in the dirt with the end of a stick. Inside each circle, he placed a stone, a feather, and a single bead, then erased it and started again. He wasn't being watched. He wasn't copying anyone. But his game, if it was one, mirrored patterns seen in other parts of the village. The quiet repetition. The sense of placing things where they were meant to go, even if only he understood the reason. A younger child joined him, copying his movements. The boy didn't correct her. He simply made room. This hour didn't belong to action. It belonged to confirmation, checking, testing, making sure. Because preparation wasn't a moment you reached, it was a shape you returned to again and again. It was the heartbeat under the quiet, the hum behind the silence. And this village had shaped itself well, not with noise, but with intention. And it was ready to listen for what came next. The sun dipped lower, its light stretching and softening across the rooftops like fingers, brushing gently across old parchment. The village didn't glow. It smoldered. Every surface caught that amber hue of approaching dusk, turning even the plainest stones into something ancient and valuable. Light no longer illuminated. It gilded. A hush hung over the square. Not silence, not absence, but reverence. As if every brick and beam were aware that the day was narrowing its gaze and asking for quiet acknowledgement in return. You could almost feel the village holding its breath. Not in fear, but in recognition of how fleeting and vital every minute now felt. In the shadow of the old kiln, 2 potters worked without speaking. They weren't forming new vessels. They were examining finished ones. Each pot, bowl, and jug was turned slowly in hand, tested with a tap, a press of the thumb, a flick of the rim. Anything that sounded wrong was set aside. Not broken, just not ready. The rest were wrapped in cloth and packed into crates, layered with straw. They weren't headed to market. They were headed underground, supplies for a time when trade stopped and survival went quiet. Behind them, another villager arranged a second stack of vessels, slightly cracked, slightly off, not for hiding but for use in case nothing else remained. Even imperfection could serve if understood correctly. Near the water's edge, 3 older villagers knelt around a flat stone slab, tracing a grid of lines with bits of charcoal. It wasn't a game. It was a schedule, a rhythm of who would guard, who would fetch water, who would carry messages when voices couldn't be used. The lines intersected like a web, a plan meant to stay hidden unless needed. Once the marks were finished, the stone was flipped face down and covered with soil and moss. To the untrained eye, it was just another rock, but to those who lived here, it was a whisper of structure, buried just beneath the surface. One of the elders tapped a second rock twice, lightly, before rising, not a signal, but a habit, a way of saying, "This is done." Along the outer wall, someone tested the tension of ropes hidden beneath the thatch. Pulley systems designed to lower ladders, raise supplies, or drop sandbags in silence. Nothing dramatic, nothing clever, just systems, fail-safes, quiet mechanics that only made sense when things went wrong. She tugged on one rope, then another, watching how they moved above her. No creaks, no slack. That was the goal, a tool that didn't announce itself. As she worked, another villager handed her a small pouch of sand to test the weight distribution. They nodded to each other without words, both aware that their work would only be noticed if it failed, and determined to keep it invisible. Inside the food cellar, 2 young women checked the clay jars, stacked along the back wall. One opened a lid, sniffed, and nodded. The other resealed it with wax and pressed a fresh strip of linen across the top. Labels had been removed days ago. Too easy to read. Now, everything was remembered by position, by scent, by weight. The jars were grouped not by type, but by how long each one could last. Freshest in the back. Oldest in front. Nothing wasted. Everything used. A third woman kneeling near a corner was repacking a loose pile of dried roots into smaller bundles wrapped in paper. Each bundle had a small notch cut in the corner, not to identify it, but to match the worn grooves in the shelf. Eyes weren't always enough when speed was required, and across from the well, a man sat on a low bench, stitching thick leather into the sole of a boot. The leather was stiff, the thread coarse, but his hands moved with the same patience as the dusk. He wasn't rushing to finish. He was reinforcing, making something stronger. That boot would walk farther than it had ever needed to before. Maybe across hills. Maybe just back and forth across the same square, hour after hour. Either way, it would hold. Behind him, another man repaired the second boot, matching pace, sharing silence. They didn't need to speak to know they were making the same journey in different ways. And through it all, the village didn't whisper now. It breathed, long and slow. Inhale, check the knots. Exhale, shift the jars. Inhale, confirm the lookout. Exhale, stitch the boot. The evening didn't ask for speed. It asked for clarity. And the village gave it, with muscle memory, with rituals honed from repetition, with a kind of stillness that came from knowing what mattered most, had already been decided, not with noise, not with ceremony, but with every small thing done right, done well, and done with purpose. Even the unseen gestures, the small corrections, the silent nods, told their own story. This was not panic. This was respect for what might come, and what they'd already endured. because preparing wasn't a single act. It was a way of living. The sky now wore its evening colors, soft purples bleeding into orange, then cooling into blue. The final warmth of the day clung to the stones beneath bare feet, but the air was turning, not cold, not biting, but aware of the dark. The village moved as if synchronized with the sky, shifting from labor to stillness, from preparation to reflection. Yet, nothing truly stopped. The surface grew quieter, but underneath, everything hummed. By the loom house, a group of women worked in near silence, their hands weaving thread through frame and spindle. They weren't making cloth for trade or decoration. This thread had purpose. It would reinforce slings, be used to mend packs, maybe even serve as tripwire in the right hands. The women didn't rush. Each knot was tight, each braid deliberate. They worked with the kind of quiet that doesn't come from tiredness. It comes from trust in the task. A younger girl watched nearby, her small fingers mimicking the motions on a scrap of twine. Beside the central tree, two men bent over a weathered piece of leather stretched between wooden stakes. They pressed symbols into the hide using hot iron brands, a language of marks, half pictograph, half warning. It wasn't for display. It would be folded and carried to the watchtower. If a signal had to be sent, a real one, it would be this leather they'd use. Each brand seared into the material smelled of smoke and memory. One man wiped his brow with a cloth, while the other adjusted the position of the hide with care, making sure no mark landed in haste. At the eastern boundary, just past the rows of herb gardens, a man buried small glass jars at equal intervals, each one filled with oil-soaked cloth. Not explosives, not traps. Just fire if needed, like fire without noise, without light unless summoned. He crouched low, using a flat stone to mark the soil after each burial. If someone didn't know where to look, they'd never find them. But he would. Or someone who'd been told. That was the key. Information moved quietly here, through eyes, through memory. Closer to the well, a group of children sat on a woven mat, playing a strange version of a counting game. But there was rhythm to it. Tap, tap, pause, clap, as if they were reciting steps for something older than they understood. One child called out a name after each round, and the others echoed it with a hand gesture. Watching nearby, a grandmother nodded faintly, her fingers repeating the same pattern in her lap. The game was more than a game. It was story. It was map. And inside a quiet room at the back of the carpenter's house, a woman sharpened a single knife. Not a weapon. A tool. The blade was curved, the handle worn. It had cut rope, trimmed meat, carved symbols. It would do so again. She worked by candlelight, not because she needed it, but because the act deserved it. A ritual. A moment. When she finished, she ran the blade gently across a patch of leather, testing, remembering, preparing. The village was quiet now, but it was not at rest, because rest comes after uncertainty. And this night, like the ones before, still held questions. And this village, as always, held the answer. Be ready. Dusk had finally claimed the sky, turning the village into a silhouette of itself. Where earlier there had been shape and shadow, now there was only suggestion. Outlines and edges softened into the blur of nightfall. Lanterns glowed dimly behind shuttered windows, casting low amber halos that reached no farther than the doorstep. The village didn't sleep. It waited. By the forge, long since cooled for the evening, a blacksmith and his apprentice sat on overturned barrels. They weren't forging, they were sorting. Small items laid out on cloth. Nails, clasps, spare hinges, broken tongs. They checked each piece, set aside what could be salvaged, melted, or reformed. Their conversation was a slow murmur, more gesture than voice. Every so often the apprentice would mark a tally on a strip of bark with the tip of a coal stick. Inventory wasn't numbers. It was readiness. Near the storage shed, A man leaned against the doorframe, cradling a long wooden staff. It wasn't a spear, not quite. The tip had been rounded, sanded smooth, more tool than weapon. He tapped it gently on the ground in intervals, not to keep rhythm, but to test the echo beneath the floorboards, listening for hollows, for shifts. When he heard something unfamiliar, a new creak, a delayed echo, he stepped inside and traced the source with the end of the staff. No urgency, just certainty, the way someone checks on a sleeping child. In one of the upper rooms of the tower, an older woman sat writing by oil lamp. The paper was thick, stained from age. Her quill scratched slowly across the surface as she copied lines from memory, adding notes, redrawing a symbol here or there. Maps, accounts, names. Not for anyone else to read, just to hold the knowledge somewhere other than inside her mind. Across the desk sat a closed tin box, locked, unlabeled. The weight of it seemed to press the room into quiet. Beneath the awning beside the well, a boy lay on his stomach, drawing with a shard of charcoal on the stone. He traced the same shape over and over, a spiral with lines shooting outward, a symbol he'd seen etched on a crate earlier in the day. No one had told him what it meant, but he remembered it. His sister joined him, adding dots around the edges. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Children understood rhythm even before they understood rules. Back in the animal pens, a girl checked on the goats, her lantern swinging low. She paused at each stall, not looking for danger, just confirming presence. One of the older animals let out a quiet bleat. She reached through the slats and rested a hand gently on its shoulder. Familiar, routine. Assurance flowed both ways. When she was done, she tied the lantern to a hook and sat on a bale of straw, listening. Not for anything in particular, just listening. The night wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, because everything worth hearing was already in motion, and everyone who mattered was already paying attention. The village was still awake, and still ready. The night deepened with intention, like ink seeping into cloth. Darkness didn't fall all at once. It gathered. It pooled in corners, settled under doorways, and nestled between stones in the path. The stars arrived without announcement, blinking into view one by one, steady and clear. No moon yet, just that silent celestial crowd, watching over the rooftops like ancient witnesses. The village below breathed slower now, but it was a breath of control, not sleep. At the edge of the fields, a pair of guards walked a slow perimeter, not armed with swords, but with heavy staves capped in bronze. They weren't hunting shadows. They were listening to them. One tapped the end of his staff against a gatepost at each pass. The other scanned the ridgeline with a lantern held low. No flare, no call-outs, just presence, quiet presence. Their boots whispered over the dirt path, a sound lost even to the wind. Each step was a word in a language no outsider would hear. Near the apothecary's hut, two women crouched beside a small pile of gathered herbs. Nightshade, valerian root, dried ginger, all separated into folded cloths and sealed with twine. Not for medicine tonight, but for trade later, or signal, or defense. Every leaf had a use. Every piece of knowledge had weight. One woman used the edge of a knife to split a root lengthwise. The other tucked away labels into a wooden box carved with small notches on the lid, a code only they knew. Beneath the canopy near the central square, 3 figures practiced hand signs in the low light. Not dramatic ones. Minimal gestures with maximum meaning. Directions, warnings, silence commands. A single open palm meant wait. 2 fingers flicked toward the ground meant scatter. They practiced until muscle memory took over, until thought wasn't required. When finished, one rolled up the cloth they'd used as a reference and tied it tight with string. The lesson was over, but the learning had just been embedded. In a quiet kitchen, someone stirred a pot over fading coals. Not a meal, a mixture. It smelled of pine sap and ash, with undertones of oil. It would coat arrows, seal leaks, signal smoke. It would be stored in clay jars and forgotten until it was needed. As it thickened, she dipped a stick into it and traced a line on a scrap of parchment. It dried fast, dark and strong. She nodded once to herself, then ladled the rest into jars, wrapping each one in cloth. And out near the boundary stones, a child traced her fingers along the rough edges of the rock. She didn't speak. She didn't move with urgency. She just leaned close, as if listening. The stones didn't answer, but they didn't need to. She stood, placed a smooth pebble on top of the largest one, and walked back toward the lantern light. This village did not wait for a horn to ready itself. It did not count minutes. It counted choices, and with every gesture, it chose the same thing. Survival, not by force, but by care, by readiness, built into the rhythm of ordinary lives.